Here we go. Chapter 5, A Tour of Discovery. The crowing of the cocks aroused us at early dawn, and my wife and I consulted on our favorite proceedings. We agreed that it was our first duty to search for some trace of our late companions, and also to explore the country, before deciding upon our future resting place. My wife understood readily that it would be impossible for the whole family to venture on such a tour, and she proposed that I would take Fritz, as he was the strongest and most useful, and then leave the younger boys under her care at the tent. I therefore begged her to prepare breakfast while I aroused the boys. They were soon awake, and I inquired of Jack what had become of his lobster. While he ran to bring it from a crevice in the rock where he had placed it for safety beyond the reach of the dogs, I told Fritz of our proposed expedition, and I added, as Jack returned, "I think you ought to give us up to Fritz the claws of the lobster, which I promised you, to provide him with a dinner on his journey today." "An excursion! An excursion!" they all cried. "Are we going, Papa?" And they began to jump and dance around me like young kids, clapping their hands with joy. "Not this time," I said. "We know not what dangers we may meet. Fritz and I have strength to bear the fatigue of a long journey. You must stay here with your mother in safety. We shall take Turk with us and leave the other dog Juno to defend you." I desired Fritz to take his gun, an axe, and a game bag, and equip myself in the same manner. I likewise placed 2 pistols in his belt, and I also loaded the game bag with powder and shot, some biscuits, and a bottle of water. Breakfast was ready by this time. It consisted of the lobster and some biscuits. What remained over was pocketed for our journey, and kneeling together in prayer, we asked for the succor and protection of all so much wanted now. We all so much wanted now. At last we parted from the family in tears, and I heard them calling after us words of encouragement and appreciation till we reached the stream which we intended to cross. The banks of the river rose abruptly, and we were obliged to follow the stream for some time before we found a spot in which we could cross. After walking a long distance, we noticed a narrow part, and contrived, by leaping from stone to stone, to reach the opposite bank in safety. The aspect of the country changed entirely, and we had forced our way scarcely 100 yards through the tall, rank grass when we heard a rustling behind us. I stopped, and looking round saw the unknown enemy, which proved to be our trusty dog Turk. We had forgotten to call him, and he had been sent after us, doubtless, by my thoughtful wife. Pursuing our journey, we reached the seashore. Here we paused, and gazed anxiously in every direction across the ocean, in the hope of discovering the boats containing our unfortunate companions. But in vain. Not even in the sand could we find a trace of any man's footprints. "Why should we trouble ourselves all about them?" asked Fritz. "They cruelly abandoned us." "My dear boy," I replied, "we ought always to return good for evil. If they could not be useful to us, we might help them greatly, for they carried nothing away from the wreck, and may be perishing of hunger." Thus talking, we continued our walk, and at the end of 2 hours reached the entrance of a wood. Here we halted to rest, seating ourselves under the cool shade of a tree by a rippling brook. Suddenly Fritz started up, saying he was sure he saw a monkey among the foliage, and the loud barking of Turk confirmed him in the idea. He ran forward to assure himself that he was right, and, while looking up, regardless of his steps, he struck his foot violently against a round, hard substance which lay on the ground. Picking it up and bringing it to me, he said, "What is this, Papa? I think it must be the nest of some bird." I smiled as I replied, "It is a nut, my boy, a coconut, too." "Some birds make round nests, I know," he persisted. "Well, certainly they do, but this is not a nest. The coconut has 2 shells, the outer one forming a thick fibrous covering, and the inner one hard and containing a milky fluid. Break it, Fritz, and you will find the real nut or kernel inside." He obeyed, but the nut was evidently an old one, and instead of finding a pleasant, refreshing milk inside, the kernel was quite decayed and unfit to eat. I proposed that we should go farther into the wood, and perhaps we might meet with a fresher one. We had not proceeded far before we found another sufficiently fresh to afford us a pleasant repast. A little farther on the wood became so thick and overgrown with lianas, which are plants, that we were obliged to cut our way through with the hatchet. We again emerged on the seashore and saw scattered here and there single trees of a remarkable appearance, which attracted the notice of Fritz. "Papa, look at those trees with the large bulbs growing at the trunks," he cried. "How absurd they look!" As I drew nearer, I found, to my great satisfaction, a group of calabash trees loaded with fruit. "What can those singular-looking bumps on the stems be?" he asked. "Gather one up," I replied, "and let's examine it." Immediately he placed in my hands a common gourd. "This gourd, Fritz," I said, "has generally a hard, dry shell, of which cups, plates, and bottles can be made. The flexible stem of the plant on which it grows winds itself around the trunks and boughs of large and strong trees, from which the gourds are suspended. For without this support, the weight of the gourd would break the branches of the plant on which it grows." After a little talk about the use of a gourd, I explained to him how the savages form the shell into bottles, spoons, and other articles, and we then set about making some dishes and plates. I showed him a better way of dividing the gourd than with a knife. Tying a piece of string tightly around the shell, I struck at it with the handle of my knife till a slight incision was made. Then, tightening the string, the nut was soon separated into two equally sized bowls. He had spoiled his own by cutting it irregularly with a knife. Filling our newly made dishes with sand to prevent them from shrinking, and leaving them to dry in the sun, we set forward again, and after walking for nearly 4 hours, we arrived at the neck of the land, which stretched far out into the sea, ending abruptly in a small but steep hill. Up this we climbed with some difficulty, but when we reached the summit, the calm ocean lay stretched before us, sparkling in the sunlight. On our left appeared a small bay, while the rich verdant verdure of the land extended almost to the water's edge. That means all the plants and stuff. After gazing with delight on this fertile spot, we examined with our glass the vast expanse of sea, but there was no trace of the other companions. We couldn't discover any of them. No habitations of man nor signs of presence could be observed on the inland. The thought that we were alone saddened me, but I remembered we had left our dear home and country with the intention of settling as colonists in a distant and strange land, and that while we could go nowhere without meeting difficulties, though we certainly did not expect to be so entirely alone, the home allotted us might have proved destitute of many advantages which were within our reach. We now descended the hill and perceived at a little distance a grove of palm trees, but to reach it we had to cross large space thickly grown with tall reeds. Advancing cautiously, for at every step we feared that we would tread upon snakes or other venomous reptiles, I made Turk go before, and as a further means of defense, cut from the reeds, which were tall and thick, one of the strongest that I could find to carry in my hand. Soon, to my astonishment, a gluttonous juice ran between my fingers. I touched it with my lips, and its taste proved at once that we had discovered a grove of wild sugar canes. Wishing Fritz, who was a little in front of me, to make the same discovery, I advised him to cut a reed as a protection. He obeyed at once and commenced striking the reeds right and left with it to frighten away serpents. In so doing, he split the cane, and the juice streamed over his hand. Without a word, he tasted it, jumping for joy, cried, "Oh, Papa, Papa, a sugar cane! Only taste it! Oh, how delicious, how delightful!" he continued, eagerly sucking at the cane. "I should like," he said, "to take some of these to my mother and brothers, as well as a few to refresh ourselves on the way." I advised him not to take too many, so he cut a dozen of the largest and stripping them of their leaves, carried them under his arm. We soon arrived at the thicket of palm trees, when a number of monkeys, startled by our footsteps and by Turk's barking, rushed up the trees, where they sat grinning and chattering. Fritz, without a moment's reflection, threw down his bundle of canes and raised his gun. But I restrained his hand and showed him the folly of cruelty of killing a poor animal that could be of no value as food, and which was excited just to no just apprehension of danger. Just see how useful they can be to us, I said. Accordingly, I picked up some stones and I threw them, but not high enough to reach the monkeys. But as I did that, their rage at this increased to fury, and presently they seized the coconuts within their reach and they flung them down at us in a perfect hail, so that we were to save ourselves, as we best could, in the shelter of the trees, or by jumping aside to avoid the by no means well-aimed missiles. Fritz laughed heartily as the success of the stratagem, and when the coconut shower had ceased, we gathered up as many as we could conveniently carry. We now sought for a suitable spot in which to enjoy the repast thus provided. We broke the outer shells with one of the hatchets, and by making a hole with a knife at stalk end of the kernel and another at the opposite end, we were able to drink the milk. After breaking the inner shell, we found a part inside, which, being easily scraped off with our new spoons, proved very agreeable eating. The juice from the sugar canes completed our delicious feast. The remains of the lobster were given to Turk, with a few biscuits, as he did not appear satisfied. We threw him some pieces of sugarcane and coconuts, which he pounced upon eagerly, and seemed to enjoy immensely. I now gathered together such of the coconuts as the long stalks, and I tied them together, to enable me to carry them more easily. Fritz took up his bundle of sugar canes, and we began our homeward march.